One thing I hope you have begun to understand is the desperate need for believers to understand the Old Testament if they're going to understand what is being taught in the New Testament. Remember that much of the imagery that we find in the New Testament is taken directly out of the Old Testament. Not only that, but the New Testament writers, in the way they write and in the allusions they make to the Old Testament, it is precisely because of that that much of the teaching and the imagery used in the New Testament comes from the Old, because the New Testament is fulfilling in many ways those things that were taught and imaged back there in the Old Testament. And if we don't understand the Old Testament, many times we miss a gospel writer when he's writing how he is using and bringing in Old Testament concepts, Old Testament teachings, making allusions to the Old Testament. We miss it altogether. One of the most eye-opening books that I think I have on my shelf is that book by Gregory Beale and D.A. Carson, The New Testament's Use of the Old Testament. It is just a gold mine. And you take a little book like 1 Peter, and you turn to that section in the book, and it's a huge section showing how many times Peter makes allusions back to the Old Testament. And many times, if we're unfamiliar, we totally miss it. We don't even see it. Not to mention the direct quotes, but the times that the Old Testament is referred to, not in a direct way, but when you follow the argument, you realize they're referring back to something that was said back there in the Old Testament. And I haven't mentioned this subject yet as in our study of submission, but as we look now in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 7, the calling of the husband, I want to bring that subject up because the section that we're going to be looking at this week and next week actually alludes back to now the book of Genesis and the story of the creation. And what Peter is doing in all of this is helping us to understand that we as children of God, we are that new creation in Christ. We are members of that new kingdom, and much of that is the fulfillment of what was portrayed back there in the very beginning in the book of Genesis before man fell into sin. We are the fulfillment of that, so to speak. And already we've seen the number of times that Peter has referred back to the Old Testament as we've gotten up into chapter 3. But even recently, in the time that he spent teaching the women about submission, if you remember, what was the central character in those few verses? It was the person Sarah. Sarah in the Old Testament is portrayed as literally the matriarch of the nation of Israel, and she's also portrayed in the New Testament as the matriarch of Christian women, of women that are following Jesus Christ. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 51, verses 1 and 2, she's portrayed as the mother of the Jewish nation. Notice what it says. Listen to me, you who pursue righteousness, you who seek the Lord. Look to the rock from which you were hewn, and to the quarry from which you were dug. And what is this quarry? What is this rock from which these children of God were hewn? Well, he tells us, look to Abraham your father, and to Sarah who bore you. What's the imagery there? That Abraham and Sarah are the patriarch and matriarch of the chosen people of God. The people of the blessing of God. If you take over into the New Testament and go to Romans 9:9, you see this same principle portrayed once again, as Sarah is portrayed as the mother now of the children of the promise. And that wonderful section in Romans 9 that talks about the difference between the physical children and the spiritual children. She's portrayed in chapter 9, verse 9, for this is what the promise said, about this time next year I will return, and Sarah shall have a son. And that relationship between the promised child of Sarah and the child born to Hagar. and the issue that we as children of God now are those children of promise. Once again in Galatians chapter 4, Sarah is alluded to as the mother of the children of the new covenant. In Galatians chapter 4, verses 22 through 26, Paul writes, "It is written that Abraham had two sons, one by a slave woman and one by a free woman." Now, who's the slave woman? Hagar. Who's the free woman? Sarah. Okay? "But the son of the slave was born according to the flesh, while the son of the free woman was born according to the promise." And there again, that principle that the children of Sarah are the children of the promise. Now, this may be interpreted allegorically. These women are two covenants. One is from Mount Sinai, bearing children for slavery. She is Hagar. Now, Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. She corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children. And here you have that contrast between Hagar representing the children of slavery, representing basically the old covenant given at Mount Sinai. And then you have Sarah, although it's not directly said, but Sarah then portraying the mother of the children of the promise, which is related to, as he says, the New Jerusalem, or the Jerusalem above, is free, and she is our mother. So all through the teaching here, you have the New Testament writers understanding and using all of these teachings and these allusions back to the Old Testament teaching, and showing now how they are fulfilled in the people of God today, the church of the living God, the true Israel, so to speak. And we find then in 1 Peter chapter 6 that Peter even alludes to Sarah, saying basically that Christian women are considered to be her offspring, her children, by following in the same example of faith that she lived. Now, I say all that to say this. We're going to see the same thing in chapter 7 in how verse 7, and how Peter is going to go back and allude to the book of Genesis in the calling that men have as to how they are to be proper husbands. If we don't understand what was taught back there in Genesis 1 through 3, we're not going to understand what it is that Peter is driving at in this verse. So when we get to chapter 3, verse 7, Peter then is using the storyline of Genesis chapter 1 through 3, or the creation and then fall of man into sin, to show properly how believers, Christian husbands today, are to treat their wives, and what we are seeking to accomplish in how we treat our wives. And I submit to you that this text, this one verse in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 7, is actually a very precise exposition of the creation, the fall, and the curse of man from a Christian perspective. Understanding then, as the new covenant people of God, what is being taught here. Now, I've said from the beginning, to kind of help us understand where we're going with this, I've said from the beginning of our study in 1 Peter that looming large in everything that Peter is teaching is his understanding of the reality of the new covenant believer as the fulfillment of God's original call and charge to man. In other words, we are that new creation, that new beginning of that new kingdom. And in that new creation and that new kingdom, God then, if we could say it this way, God is bringing to fulfillment what things were supposed to be, if we could say it that way, before man fell into sin. Now, I say that hesitantly because certainly the fall of man, the creation falling into sin, was not an accident. It was not that God was saying, "Ooh, I never saw that coming." So when I say it was supposed to be, I'm saying that had man not fallen into sin, had sin not been brought into the plan, then this is a restoration of how those things should have been, how men should live out their calling as husbands in a God